Live, where news comes first. This is ABC-7 Xtra.
Good evening, I'm Maria Garcia. Glad you're with us tonight. Well, we here at ABC-7 believe that thoughtful, complete coverage is important. We understand that the soundbite is part of the news, but we also know it's vital to bring you thorough, in-depth interviews with people who are shaping our communities and our country. That's why every week, ABC-7 Extra brings you an unscripted, more in-depth discussion. We've had lawmakers of all platforms on this program, city and state lawmakers, and of course congressmen. And tonight we're talking with the congressman who's actually never been on the program, Republican Steve Pearce, who represents New Mexico. Joining us tonight, we have a lot to cover. The GOP's efforts this week to block the president's executive orders on immigration, the economy, those stagnant wages, how to help the dwindling middle class, the environment, fracking in New Mexico, and much more. Your questions, of course, you can email them to ABC7Xtra at KVIA.com. Call us at 915-496-1775 if you have a comment or a question. On Twitter, you can tweet me at MariaGABC7, or you can use the hashtag ABC7Extra. Now, before our discussion begins, let's take a look at the battle brewing in Washington this week over immigration. Republicans have vowed to do anything they can to scale back President Obama's actions on immigration reform. And this week, they made their biggest statement yet.
The yeas are 236 and the nays are 191. The bill is passed.
The Republican-controlled House passed legislation that would fund the Department of Homeland Security through the end of September, but also block President Obama's executive actions on immigration.
We do not take this action lightly, but simply there is no alternative. This executive overreach is an affront to the rule of law and to the Constitution itself.
Democrats were outraged.
In the wake of the recent Pearce tragedy, we need to remain vigilant with smart enforcement policies that protect Americans.
Under the executive action President Obama unveiled late last year, more than 5 million undocumented immigrants would receive temporary legal status, but not citizenship. Almost all of them, 4.1 million, are the parents or families of U.S. citizens who have been here in the U.S. for more than 5 years and have no criminal record. The Department of Homeland Security funding will now head to the Senate, which could take out the immigration measures. President Obama has vowed to veto any legislation that chips away at his immigration actions. All right, and here's how congressmen from the borderland voted on the bill this week. Democrat Beto O'Rourke of El Paso voted no. In District 23, Republican Will Hurd voted yes. New Mexico Congressman Steve Pearce, also a Republican, voted yes. And joining me now is Congressman Steve Pearce. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Absolutely, I enjoy it.
Yeah, we know you had a really busy week and you have an early flight tomorrow, so we're glad you're here. So tell us, why did you vote to block President Obama's executive actions on immigration?
Basically, it comes back to what the Speaker was saying. There's just simply a question of what the President has the right to do or not to do. I think that's what the whole election was about. I think people are a little bit alarmed that the President seems to be taking the law into his own hands. That's not the way our system is set up. I think the people voted not for deep Republican principles, but for us to be a check and balance against his overreaching power grabs. I think people are becoming alarmed by that. Even Democrat senators on Capitol Hill at different points have said he doesn't have the right to do that. The President himself said about 20 times, I don't have the right to do that. People were urging him to. Then he went and did it. And so I think that's the real battle that is shaping up, one over rule of law, constitutional issues.
Right. Well, he said he didn't have the right for immigration reform, but some say this is not reform. This is just an executive action to prevent deportation for 5 million people, not to reform the entire system and change the legal status for 30 million.
He said that he didn't have the right to do it. So, again, he says, I'm not emperor. Does he think now that he is? I mean, these are significant questions in our process. The way that we design and make laws come from that. The reinterpretation of what this prosecutorial discretion is was very far-ranging. I can just tell you that. We have U.S. attorneys who serve in Congress.
But you know, Congressman, this isn't anything new. Many presidents have taken executive action on immigration, including Republicans. Ronald Reagan, the senior Bush did it. So why continue on this path to stop the president's executive orders, especially on a bill that funds one of the agencies that essentially protects us from terrorism? How do you respond to people who say that this is playing politics at its worst?
No, I think it's exactly the opposite, that it's the only vehicle that we have to express ourselves. When a president overreaches, and there have been presidential executive orders forever, the size and the scale, I think, plus the number of people involved speak very loudly. I think the American people are getting uncomfortable. Americans are saying, where are the jobs for us? Studies that have been conducted recently are showing that most of the 5 million recent jobs have gone to people who've come here, not to U.S. citizens. And so you're getting this great tension in society. And I think that the voters came to the polls in November and expressed complete concern about what the president's doing. We're there to reflect what the voters are saying.
Now, at this point, there's been so much debate and really so little action on immigration reform as a whole that it's becoming sort of a tired issue. But still, everyone agrees that at least the system is broken, that something needs to be done, that something needs to be done. So if Congress is so dysfunctional that they cannot come together to pass some sort of immigration reform, why not allow the president to do something about it, even if it's not reform?
You're beginning at the point that Congress is dysfunctional. Actually, Congress works fairly well. In the public, Democrats want us to go this way, Republicans want us to go this way. Congress is a reflection of the public. The public is not easily, they don't have it firmly in their mind. So yes, it has taken a long time. It took 100 years to get rid of slavery. Everybody thought that it should be gotten rid of, but our process works slow. And so we are a reflection of the people. The people do not want an amnesty program. They rejected when President Bush had his X visa, or Z visa, they rejected that intensely and began, the Senate just walked away. The flashback and anger was so strong. So when the Senate last year acted to create the amnesty program, the pathway, whatever you want to call it, the American public began to push back.
But polls show that a majority, if at least not a plurality of Americans, want immigration reform. So
Absolutely.
The public does want immigration
reform. They
reform.
want immigration reform, but they
do
not want amnesty. They want immigration reform. Democrats want amnesty. Republicans don't want amnesty, but I will tell you, even across the line, Democrats are saying, we want reform but not amnesty, and what the Senate bill was amnesty. I think, and I suggested it early in the session last year, that if the president had been willing to do a guest worker visa or a guest worker program, I think that we could have gotten that. I have been pushing for this, that we should secure the border first, fix legal immigration, because it takes maybe 20 years to get an answer, and that's completely not workable in today's world. And then finally, then what do we do with the people who are here? And I would suggest a guest worker plan. I went to my very conservative Republican friends and said, could you do a guest worker plan? This is during the last Congress. They said yes. I went to Luis Gutierrez. He says, I'm close enough to talk. We all talk and chat back and forth. Luis and I are pretty good friends, actually. We walk over to the floor together. And he said, I'm close enough to talk. And yet the president was, I think he wanted a political issue. You would, if you're going to persist in the question, and I mean it's a fair question, you have to look at why that the Democrats had a veto-proof or a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi was in the House, President Obama was in the White House, and they did not pass it then. I believe they understood the backlash that's going to occur at the polls if they go in and create dramatic changes to the amnesty plan or these pathways. And so that really is at the core of understanding that I think that the Senate realized that we weren't going to just take it up. They had total power and didn't do it, and it's because they understood where the American people are.
I want to talk about what is arguably, I think, one of the most pressing issues right now, and that is the dwindling middle class. Others call it income inequality. Since 1979, American workers productivity has increased 80%, but the average American wage has only increased less than 10%. So in other words, Americans are working harder than ever, middle-class Americans, but they're earning less than they did, say, 50 years ago if you adjust for inflation. How do we tackle the problem?
Well, it's, in my opinion, and my background is business and economics, and so I've worked on this almost my whole life. There are several pushes that are occurring. Number one, you can't overlook the fact that we have people coming in to the country from outside, a lot without documentation, and they're working for less than what U.S. workers would. We can see in the oil field where they don't have enough workers. Wages for truck drivers recently in the east side of New Mexico were at $100,000 a year for truck drivers. In other words, that's what happens when you have too few workers. So we've had this influx of workers here, and it's causing the wages to go down. A second thing, and it's not well talked about, it's not talked about even by Republicans, but most of what occurs in Washington is not Democrat versus Republican. It's big versus small.
Right.
So the big companies are receiving preferential treatment from both parties, but especially right now under Obama, Wall Street is making dramatic profits, and those profits are driving the high-end wages up, and the low-end wages are being pulled the wrong direction by people coming into the country. If we want the middle class to start growing, we'll start recognizing small businesses are the backbone of wage increases. We had a small business, we competed with major international corporations. The only way we got people to come to work for us, those guys had better uniforms, better trucks, better everything, but we paid more. And so always it's the small guys who boost wages up. But in this fight, big versus small, that's occurring in Washington, the middle class, the small businesses are being eliminated and being gobbled up by the big companies. And so that's probably the two strongest elements.
Well, there's talk that the president will present some economic ideas in his State of the Union speech to help middle-class Americans and middle-class companies, offering small businesses tax credits to offset administrative expenses while increasing capital gains taxes for the wealthiest companies and the wealthiest Americans. Would you support something like this?
It depends on what it looks like. I will tell you that that when the president says that he can offer tax breaks for one company and not for another, that gets very hard to put into law. I will just tell you as a small...
But I mean, if the issue is about big versus small, and here's the president saying, hey, let's give tax breaks to the small businesses and crack down on taxes.
You have to understand that everything the president says doesn't mean that it's necessarily so. He has said adequately in 2 or 3 of his states of the union since I've been back in Congress that the corporate tax rate in America is the highest in the world and it needs reform. I personally sent a letter, signed it myself, sent it to the White House saying, sir, I'll work across party lines, I'll work across every line because I agree with you on that. I've never heard from him to this day. So many times he says he's going to do things and he doesn't. It is very difficult to craft a law that would give you a tax increase and me a tax decrease. That's very difficult to put that into law and then enforce it. I would be happy to do those things that make sure that the big corporations are paying their fair share. But on the other side, to be sitting here raising taxes on middle-class Americans, which 2 years ago at the end of the year, everybody in America got a tax increase when he came through with that big plan. Some Republicans voted for it. I did not because the middle class is being squeezed. People are just trying to make ends meet. And every time we increase their taxes, we make it harder on them. Obamacare was a major hit to the middle class.
Right. And you know, some say that it's sort of opportunistic to talk about wage stagnation right now and blame it on the Obama administration, on Democrats, when really this is a deeply historic issue that started, some would argue, as early as the mid-70s. And some would say with GOP, Republican-led laws that favor the rich.
No. If you look at Wall Street right now, under President Obama, the rich in Wall Street are getting dramatic profits that are created by his Dodd-Frank legislation. That was passed by the Democrat House, the Democrat Senate, and signed by him. It is killing the opportunity for small businesses and local homeowners to get loans for their own homes. I hear regularly from people in New Mexico, southern New Mexico, how they've got good credit, everything is lined up, and yet they can't get a loan. That's because of the regulations that were put into place by Dodd-Frank. It was supposed to regulate big banks. Instead, it regulated Main Street banks, and Wall Street was not even touched by it. So they're finding record profits right now under the Obama administration. I voted against the TARP bailouts. I voted against every one of the bailouts to Wall Street that occurred in 2008. I think they're totally wrong. But both administrations, that was Nancy Pelosi at that time working with George Bush, and now under President Obama, Wall Street is getting much favorable treatment.
You know, there are obviously complex issues here, but if middle-class wages haven't increased at the same pace that productivity has increased in the last 40 years, while the top 1% has increased in their wages more than 200%. There's a problem beyond
and
that
I keep
current
telling you that
administration.
there has to be something said about the number of people who are coming into this country looking for work. They are driving the lower end wages down because they will work for less. Again, I would take you straight to the east side of New Mexico. Right now the wages are falling because the oil and gas is going through a very unstable period. But up until 30 days ago, if you wanted to drive a truck in the eastern side of New Mexico, you could do that for $100,000 a year. I was bringing employers from over in the Hobbs-Lee County area into the Sunland and Opera area. We were hiring people from there. One lady grabbed me by the sleeve and Anthony in the cafe and said, my sister, she was 49 and she had given up on life. Her kids had graduated and she couldn't find a job. She got a job for $18 an hour, Mr. Pearce, over in Lee. She goes over and they pay her housing. They pay for her food while she's there. She comes home for a week. She works 2 weeks a month. She's going to make $60,000 to $80,000 a year entry level. That's what happens when the wages are, when the workforce is just allowed to maintain its own level. But if we're going to continue to say that you can come to this country and work regardless if you have documentation, regardless of whether you need you, yes, they are going to they're going to drive the lower wages down. That's just a part of economic truth.
Okay, we have to take a commercial break. We'll be right back. We're going to talk about some issues in New Mexico, some environmental issues, so stay with us. You're watching ABC-7 Extra. You can call us at 496-1775, email us at ABC7Extra at KVIA.com, or tweet me at Maria G. ABC7. We'll be right back. Welcome back to ABC-7 Extra. Joining me tonight is Republican Congressman Steve Pearce. Thank you again for joining us.
Absolutely.
We had a very engaging first segment. I want to ask you about some of the environmental issues in New Mexico. Energy companies have been seeking permits to explore natural gas extraction through fracking in Moore County in New Mexico. Some residents there have expressed concern because the area's traditional livelihoods, farming and ranching, depends on clean sources of water, and so they're concerned that fracking will contaminate their water. What is your position on fracking?
Absolutely. The hydraulic fracturing is what is causing the cost of gasoline to fall to $2. It's good for the American consumer, and that's probably the most powerful thing to know about it. Now, one of the recent leaders in the Obama administration admitted that they didn't have any actual result ever showing that fracking had contaminated fresh water. I know all the things that occurred on 60 Minutes with the water that supposedly was catching on fire, and most of that was staged. I live in an area, and we've been fracking for 50 years over there. Fracking is not a new process. But what it is doing is allowing us to be competitive on the world stage and drive the cost of gasoline down. Right now, the Saudis are flooding the world market with oil, driving the cost of oil down to below $60, down in the 50-40 range. And that's going to be good for our economy, good for our consumers. Right now, people are spending the money that they're not putting in their gas tank in the restaurants. We're starting to see activity pick up there. The last quarter of last year, the economy grew at about 5%, and that's because people had the money to spend and not having to put it in their tank.
Right.
So it's a good process.
You know, the residents there in Moore County passed an ordinance prohibiting fracking or trying to prevent it.
Yeah.
And so the companies there sued the county.
Sure.
For residents there who say, you know, we're at a disadvantage when these multi-million-dollar corporations are taking us to court for trying to self-govern our community. And if we don't want fracking, we're at a disadvantage if they
Actually,
take us to
I
court.
represent right up to
Right.
the edge of that county. And so people would come to me and say, you know, this was not us. This was just the county commission. And so there's a deep voice there on the other side saying, we want the jobs. We would like some of those $60,000 and $70,000 a year jobs coming into our community. I'm good friends and on a committee with one of the representatives in deep South Texas. And he said, you know, we used to have a kind of an attitude out there. We didn't like the oil companies. But he said in the last year and a half or something, he said they've paid local landowners $2 billion to local landowners, small people. And so what the local county says, you're going to take away the right for a local private property owner to lease his land to someone who will come in and produce it. I think the bigger question is, does a local government have the right to take away property rights? Those were given to us by our founding fathers because they separated our way of life from every government up to that time. Up to that time, you had kings, you had noblemen. They had status, and they could keep you from owning property. And so when our founding fathers came here, that was one of the keys to our Constitution. Recently, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the Chinese, the communist Chinese, had to start allowing private property rights because they couldn't compete worldwide. And so when a county in New Mexico does something that even the communist Chinese are saying, wait, we need this impetus, we need this encouragement for local people to be able to hold and build wealth, for them to say, no, we're going to outlaw you being able to work with those companies. I think the companies have a right.
Yeah, but I mean, there's still some concerns, I think, over the safety of fracking. There's not, you know, a whole lot of research on it, but there are.
Oh, they've been fracking for 50 years. This is not a new technique.
Yeah, but there are legitimate concerns about pouring millions of gallons of water with chemicals into the earth, and I think
and like I said, there is one of the leading people in the BLM. I think one of the regulatory agencies says we have no documented evidence of fresh water being contaminated by the fracturing process. It's something that is technologically becoming far more sophisticated than it used to be. The oil company doesn't want any problem to occur. They ruin a well if they have a frac job that fails and cracks the casing. Usually in the water zones, there are at least 3 concentric strings of pipe. So they start with a pipe about this big. They put cement behind it. They come in and put another layer of pipe, and then a third layer, and that's the one where they put the pressure on. And so the oil companies don't want to ruin their $7 or $8 million investment. So they're the ones who watch it most carefully. Again, if people are willing to take away the private property rights for someone else who would like to lease their land to an oil company, I'm not sure that we want others to be able to say, you can't use your house for what you want to. You can't use your livelihood. You can't get it the way you want to. That drives against the basic theme of America.
Okay, we have to take another break. We'll be right back. You're watching ABC-7 Extra. Call us at 496-1775. Email us at ABC7Extra@KVIA.com or tweet me at MariaGABC7. We'll be right back. Welcome back to ABC-7 Extra. Joining me tonight, Republican Congressman Steve Pearce. Thank you for being on the program. I want to talk about abortion. This week is the anniversary of Roe versus Wade. Recently, you tweeted, quote, pro-life policies delivering. Nearly 25% of abortion clinics closed in the last 5 years. In 2014, 60 of them closed. So for people who believe that kind of pro-life policy restricts access, much needed access to clinics by women, what do you say?
Well, again, to me, it comes back to the constitutional question. If it's a life, then every nation is judged, the heart of a nation is judged on how it treats the most fragile of life, and there's no more fragile life than the unborn. And so I believe that women have the right to choose up to the point that there are 2 lives. But at that point, then we owe it as a country to protect that life. So I think that's a critical thing. The Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade, it left that question hanging, saying we're not sure when life begins, and so we're going to approve all abortions. And if later information shows when life begins, well, now then DNA is set day one. It never changes through a life. Now then, the heartbeat, we now know that at day 22 you have the heartbeat and it's pumping its own source of blood. People say, well, it doesn't look like a life at one day. No, it looks exactly like every other life at one day. So life when you're 2 years old looks much different than when you're 100 years old. Life at 2 days looks very much different than it does at 9 months. So if it's a life, then I think we have a constitutional responsibility to protect and to honor that, except in the most extreme cases. There are obviously things where people would say, you know, rape or incest, that we really need a deeper discussion.
But for women who say there is something fundamentally wrong about lawmakers crafting policy to regulate what I can do with my body.
No, it's, again, if it wasn't a second life, that argument would be far more potent. But when there's a second life, they're wrestling with this in some other nations. One of the Norway or Denmark, I think, just recently said you can abort a child at any age. Well, that when we began to say that it's a matter of choice, then that choice wants to extend further and further. So there have been people suggesting in this country that we would want to be able to allow abortion 60 days after the birth. So that's the question you get into, this moral slippery ground that we would get on. This is one of the most difficult questions. My family has wrestled with this question. I'm sure most families out there. I don't mean to make it sound that it's easy, but I think that we have a responsibility to look at the deeper lying questions. If we're going to say that life is essentially a matter of choice and convenience, we're about to go into an area where the aging will be, the baby boomers are going to be a tremendous burden on society. The older you get, the more expensive. And so we're already starting to see then those wrestling with arbitrary ending of life at the end of life. And so we should be very cautious as we go through these discussions to understand that it's not just the unborn, but at the end of life. And so you got some of the discussions early on there. There have been elected officials saying that old people have a responsibility to die, and so I mean, these things.
I think that's a big jump. I think it's a big jump to go into an abortion.
Life is life, and if you're going to protect it, it doesn't matter if it's the beginning or the end, and it's not, in my mind, is not dissociated at all. It comes from a belief of what responsibility do we have to stand up for the most fragile. The question came up really deeply in the Terry Schiavo case. She was kept alive by feeding tubes, not by breathing apparatus. And if you take away a feeding tube, then you suddenly have to deal with the people who are fed with spoons, because the courts don't recognize a difference between a feeding tube and a feeding spoon. And that gets very uncomfortable when people say she should have been taken off of those tubes. Well, then you should take the spoons away in these places where the tremendously disabled are serviced. And so these questions all are very closely linked. I'm sorry, I just don't see that there's such a separation that you do. We could discuss it for a long time.
Right. You know, but aside from the ideological difference, there's pragmatic consequences to these kinds of policies. There's women in Texas who have to travel out of town now, who have to go to other cities to get an abortion. Is that an undue burden created by politics?
I don't know. I don't know if you can declare anything an undue burden when you're saying you should think more carefully about this life. Recent studies by pro-choice institutes are showing that something like 91% of the abortions are elective. Well, that chills most people. A very heavy percent of people are tremendously uncomfortable with the elective. Almost everybody feels somewhat comfortable with with things that are needed for the health of the mom or for the baby. But when you have a healthy mom and a healthy baby, and people find that 91% of the cases fall in that, then society gets very uncomfortable. So I think we've got a lot of discussions down the track. But the reason the Planned Parenthood clinics are closing is not because of law. It's because young women are seeing the sonograms and they're making choices that this is not just a blob of tissue. They're saying this is a life, and they've been told differently. And so it is the lack of demand that's causing the closing of those clinics. The numbers of abortions are plummeting. This went from basically a pro-choice nation to a pro-life nation. 51% of young women, or 50% of the female population is now pro-life because they see those sonograms. And so again, very difficult discussion that needs to continue. We need to be discussing these things publicly because they affect us all as we go through our lives.
Okay, thank you so much, Congressman
Absolutely,
Pearce.
thank you.
They're telling me that we are out of time. I think people were just glued to what you were saying because we got no tweets or phone calls. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on ABC 7 Extra. We hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.